Right, everyone. If I can have your attention, please. We're going to start the first talk of the evening. If you could all have a seat, please. I love this microphone.
Hi, could I just get that tune just get you to hand it around to everyone?
Sure.
Thank you.
Right, so for the first talk, apparently we have some handout that will become relevant throughout the talk. So if you could take one, pass them around the back. Right, okay, so for the first talk of the evening, we've got Shehraz talking about Computer Chronicles and the Wayback Machine. Take it away.
Okay, evening everyone. Is everyone able to hear me okay? Brilliant, perfect. Okay, so as I've been introduced, Marius was saying, I'll be talking about Computer Chronicles and the Wayback Machine. Just before I begin, can I just ask, has anyone heard the names of Stuart Chaffee or Gary Kildall before? Okay, you have. Gary Kildall, yeah, absolutely. And anyone else? No. Okay, that's interesting. Hopefully you'll have a bit more information by the end of the talk. So this is a presentation, wee bit of a unique thing where I'm covering two topics in the one. There are various images throughout the presentation. I try and credit people where relevant. Most of the images that are not credited, including the two you see here, have been used by permission of Stuart Chaffee, who, as you'll soon see, was quite relevant to Computer Chronicles. And there's a sheet going around at the moment. It's just relevant, just something to keep with you that you can take with you for reference. Any slide that's relevant to the sheet, bottom right slide, so just refer to that one. Okay, so I'll be covering Computer Chronicles, a United States television series, website called the Internet Archive that I'm sure quite a few of you have seen already, and the Wayback Machine, which is related to the Internet Archive. So I just want to give a wee bit of perspective for a couple of seconds. For me, my introduction to the series Computer Chronicles was through the Macintosh. This is the Mac G4, something I used at school, particularly in my last year. And when I went to university, I believe I did a course in my second year called Computer Literacy. And this was just a general introduction to computing and just trying to get some more background on something that I was really attracted to. So it was like a 30-point module I did. And in one of those assessments for the module, I had to do a talk on something I was interested in, so I chose the Macintosh. And I was wanting to find a television series, an episode that might make me interested, get people interested in it. And I found an episode of the Computer Chronicles called The Macintosh Computer. And that's what got me into this, and it's something that I've been riding along since 2005. So in terms of the Computer Chronicles, it's a local series that was launched in 1981 in the United... Oh, oops. Oh, well. Technical issues. So yeah, it was a local series that was launched in 1981. It was created by Stuart Chaffee. He has a background in journalism and politics and other areas. And at the time, he was running his own television station, KCSM TV, in San Mateo, California. And even though he wasn't directly working in technology, it was always a passion of his. So at the time, in the early 1980s, late 1970s, there wasn't anything like the internet, of course, but there were BBSs. And you had all these technology enthusiasts who would meet once a week and have these discussions. And he thought, this is great. This is a way for me to get these discussions, to get everyone together and get people talking about technology. So he created a local series where once a week for half an hour to an hour, people would talk about technology. And this was streamed live, well, broadcast live on television. Unfortunately, none of these tapes are still in existence. But it was still interesting that they had this local series. So Stuart Chaffee started getting letters from around the United States saying, we've heard about this local series in San Francisco, more or less, broadcast BBS discussion on technology. How can we get involved in this? So he decided to lead it to a national series, and in 1983, created Computer Chronicles that became a national television series. This series covered personal computing, the rise of the personal computer. It was a weekly series that lasted between 1983 to 2002. You had 19 to 20 seasons over that time. These are the two presenters. This is from the very first episode. Stuart Shefay on the right and Gary Kildall on the left. And Gary Kildall, not many people know about him. I'll get to him in a bit. He was one of the most influential people within personal computing in the early days of Silicon Valley. Unfortunately, he's not well known in this day and age. So through the series of Computer Chronicles, there were varying presenters. Most of them worked through the series across different parts of it. Probably the most two prominent would be the middle one, at the top, Herb Lechner. He worked for SRI in the 1960s and 70s. And George Morrow, that created products such as the Morrow Pivot, but that dates back to the 80s, so it's not that well known now. So eventually it became really popular. It was broadcast worldwide. Of course, internet streaming wasn't really a thing at the time, or at least in its infancy, so it was broadcast through satellite mainly. It was translated into different languages, including French, Spanish, and Arabic. And interestingly, for the first series in 1983, Computer Chronicles was possible because of an English company called Micro Focus. With it being broadcast on a public network, they needed funding from various sources, and it was this English company that still exists today that provided funding for it. So the first season was unique in the sense that it had a structured approach. Herb Lechner wrote a book, and all these titles here in the book matched the episode of the first season of the series. And it was after the first season that I wouldn't say it went off track, but it found its own identity, where through different years it would cover something that was relevant. For example, they charted the evolution of the Macintosh, the Newton that a talk had been given about before, and many other technologies. The great thing about the series was it wasn't just related to one company or one product. It was everything within personal computing or technology in general. So there were three eras. 83 to 89 are called the classic era. That's the one that's most well known. 89 to 94, that I would call the early 90s era. And then 94 to 2002, and that's where really the internet became relevant within the series. So if you want, at the time, there was no way to download episodes, so you could order episodes through a mail list, only available in the US and Canada, unfortunately. So I'm sure until it was made available, there were many bootlegs out there. So I'll just quickly go through some relevant episodes that were relevant to me and are also quite popular. There's Mainframes to Minis to Micros, the very first national episode of the series. You can see here the two presenters. You've got the HP 150 computer. You've got Herb Lechner, and then that's Cyril Yansuni from HP demonstrating a product. That's how the format would normally be. They'd have some kind of a broadcast, I don't know what you would call it. I guess a wee mini clip introducing the topic for the show. Then they'd have a demonstration of the series that more often than not went haywire. But unfortunately, this was done live, so sometimes literally you just had to make it fly. But it was a good thing. It was one of the first touchscreen computers they showed on the series. Then you had the Macintosh computer. This is the one that introduced me to the series, 1985, probably one of the more popular ones. Then Unix, which would be quite useful for people here who are interested in Linux and Unix. Then there's the Amiga and the Atari. You can see most of these episodes are from the 1980s. This is from the era when they were most popular, Commodore 64. Now, this is the Gary Kildall special. Just want to spend a few minutes talking about him. Unfortunately, he's mostly known as the man who could have been Bill Gates, or the person who went flying when IBM called. But this person was much more than that. He is probably responsible for setting the personal computer on the path it's led to today. So along with his wife, he set up a company in the late 1970s, originally called Digital Intergalactic Research, later shortened to Digital Research. He, in the mid-1970s, I believe, was working as a consultant for Intel. He was a computer scientist by trade and was teaching lecturing programming at a naval university, I believe. And he had seen, at the time, that there were Unix computers. If an executable program was compiled on one Unix system, if you tried to run that on a second Unix system, unless it was an identical system, it wouldn't run. So what he did was create a program, well, an operating system called CPM, that stood for Control Program for Microprocessors, an operating system which would allow for the first time applications to run on many different systems without having to be recompiled. So he also co-presented the Computer Chronicles between 1983 and 1989. There's this deal in 1980. He had become very popular with CPM and his company Digital Research, and IBM had gone first to Bill Gates and Microsoft about licensing the DOS operating system for running on the new personal computer. But Bill Gates, it said, went to Gary Kildall and Digital Research on his approach, because the Microsoft DOS seemed to be a clone of Gary Kildall's CPM. So to try to make a deal with them, unfortunately, didn't happen. They were making unreasonable demands. So eventually, IBM tried to reach a deal with both Microsoft and Digital Research. But unfortunately, what Gary Kildall didn't know, even though his CPM had been the first software, they had said, we want to put both operating systems onto our personal computer and let the market decide which one's going to be popular. But as I said, unbeknownst to Gary Kildall and this company, they were going to charge CPM for $240, whereas Bill Gates' DOS, Microsoft's DOS would go for $40. So you'd have the 6-to-1 price difference, 6-to-1 price difference. So unfortunately, the market decided that it was going to be Microsoft DOS that was going to be the prevalent operating system and not CPM. But even so, his contributions continued. He went through graphical interfaces such as GEM, etc., and he also worked on the early CD-ROM, helping to produce the first early encyclopedia. Some would take for granted today with Wikipedia, for example. So unfortunately, this unfortunate incident with IBM, and I guess the fact that many times his desire as a computer scientist to be noted for something led to him becoming, in his later years, slightly embittered, and that he felt that I believe he felt that he wasn't getting the recognition for his work, not so much for money, but so much that just because of what he'd worked on, you wanted to be recognized for that. So unfortunately, he ended up dying over that. But still, this is his office. This is where the DRI offices were based, and they had to raise the platform up in order to fit in the new computer that they're putting in the basement. So the whole structure was raised for that. So I'll just quickly go through some of the remaining episodes. We have here this. I walk up this Ramsey Lane quite often to get to work. So here's Stuart Shefay standing in Ramsey Lane with the Scottish Piper in the background, going on about how in the 1990s Silicon Glen was a very popular thing, and so this was their effort to try and move out of the United States and try and have a worldwide perspective, which they'd done before. For example, they'd covered Japan, but I felt it was notable that they came here. And then I believe this is the old informatics building on South Bridge. And then we have some old supercomputers here. And then leading into 2001, they started talking about Microsoft Windows XP, and they brought the internet into it. So the Computer Chronicles itself has a lasting legacy. It was quite a niche thing for a long time because not many people know about it or Gary Kildall's contributions. But over the last few years, I've noticed that it started being more popular. It was used a lot of time. Episodes were packaged into computer manuals and computer educational books and CD-ROMs. It was also used in legal cases and lawsuits. I was talking about this with someone a bit earlier on, where the idea that you almost have this compendium of information available. So if a company says, we created X product, another company says, no, we created X product, they can go back to the archive and use these episodes as evidence if necessary. And also in modern society, there's a YouTube channel called Computer Show where they've done a send-up of the series, but I think in quite a flattering way. So that's good. If you watch an episode of, say, the first episode mentions the menus to micros, and then try and find an episode of Computer Show, I think you'll see how it's had an impact on society. So there was a sister series called Net Cafe that ran between 1996 and 2002. Both series, I would say, ended mainly because of the dot-com bust, because they were both ran on the public network. They needed public funding to run. So unfortunately, when that happened, they ran out of money, they stopped. They had many guests, including Bruce DeKayler. Hopefully I'm saying his name right. He was notable because he created the Internet Archive and also the Wayback Machine. And he had a discussion with this creator of both of these series, Stuart Shefay, after the end of one episode, where they were saying, you have all these episodes on tape stored. Why don't we get these archived and made available to everyone, to the public for free, so anyone can access them and download them? So it was through this communication that the Computer Chronicles and Netcafe became available on the Internet Archive. So this leads into the Internet Archive itself. It was founded in 1996. It holds many collections which are freely accessible and can be downloaded as many times as you wish. It's interesting in the sense that it's a precursor to YouTube, where even today people can upload content and share it with people. It's just that the platform is probably less mature than YouTube became. But it's still interesting, it's still around. The Wayback Machine itself has been online since 2001, but it was previously stored on tape. So they started archiving the internet prior to 2001. But it only became possible, cheap enough to make this information accessible in 2001. And I believe it's as of 2016, the Wayback Machine holds over 15 petabytes of data. So very quickly, the Internet Archive is a non-profit organization, basically an online library where anyone can access information, download information that they wish. It could be concerts that have been freely made available that are not copyrighted, old books, movies, clips, it doesn't matter, there's many things. There's also full university lecture courses on there, which I've used myself in the past. The Wayback Machine, of course, is a part of this, which you can see at the top. And then this shows you some parts of the archive. You can also get iOS apps and Android apps as well. So if you don't want to use the web interface, you can use these to access the Internet Archive. And you can also browse the collections and just stream or download it locally to your device. So the Internet Archive is very powerful in the sense that if, like, say, for example, I wanted to find out about the Computer Chronicles, I can go through this drop-down list, and it's such a complete catalogue now, it can actually crash your computer if you don't have enough RAM, which I've found out myself. But you can go through and use this powerful tool to be able to find out, do it by date, etc., to find out exactly what you want. And then there's different ways of doing so, and then you can use operators, etc. So this is how a collection might look in the Internet Archive. We have here the Computer Chronicles. There's over 500 episodes available online. Some of them translations, as I mentioned earlier, but most of them, the vast majority of the series should be available. Here is a discussion forum. This is what I used originally to get in contact with Stuart Shefay back in 2005, because I wanted to cover the series on my website, so I wanted to get permission from him to use some of the screen caps, etc. And I was able to do that through this. So this is what an episode may look like. You can download them directly through HTTP, or you can also legally torrent them using a torrent client of your choice. And I've downloaded quite a few episodes through there. So again, this is what an archive of a particular episode might look like. So the raw file would be uploaded, and then they've introduced a backend that would transcode the files into different formats depending on your device. So again, this is collections from different Linux applications and lectures. So just to very briefly talk about the Wayback Machine. The Wayback Machine is this tool you can use. You put in any website into this, and as long as it's been catalogued, you're able to go and find the website and get a history of it. The idea is it's literally a history of the internet that anyone can access. It's fully free, you don't have to pay for it. It's usually through donations that this archive is kept alive. And although the main archive is based in the US, there are several backups of the Wayback Machine all around the world. So here's my website. So if I needed to prove, well, I've been interested in Computer Chronicles and other topics back to 2000, I can go back through the history and say, well, this is what my website looked like when I was a teenager, for example. So you're probably wondering, why is there the strange Animac vets here on there? Well, this is what the shop looks like now. This is based near South Bridge, near Nicholson Square. Or I've just passed it. If I go here, I don't know if anyone went to this. This used to be called Twitch Gaming. It was based near the South Side pub, and this existed between 2011 and 2014. The idea is it was a gaming centre that people could go to. It was quite cool. I went there quite a few times. Unfortunately, it didn't last very long, so it's gone now. But it was cool while it lasted. So if I go to twitch-gaming.com to try and access it, of course the company doesn't exist anymore, so the website's gone. So I'll go to the Wayback Machine. So I'll put in the website. It shows you that it existed between 2010 and then stopped after 2016. I click on a particular year, then you can go by date so you can see how it's evolved over time. The dates that you can use are usually every 3 months or so. It doesn't always archive a website. There's usually a set time between the crawler going out and going after a website. And the great thing is, if you don't want your website crawled, just use a robots.txt file on the root of your website. Yeah.
So just referencing the robots.txt, there's this problem where people let their domain expire, like that one.
Yeah.
And then someone else buys it, and for whatever reason they decide they don't want that history accessible, and then so they add it to their robots.txt, and it removes the history. So which seems quite controversial to me. Kind of deleting the past is like burning books or something, maybe not that controversial, but what do you think about that, and do they have an opinion on it, and stopping others from revealing someone else's history?
No, I know what you mean. Yeah, because the robot.txt file would then delete the whole history of the website. I believe that's how it works. I think it's a difficult one. I think usually what you can do is contact the archive directly, because they'll always keep copies of the file, at least temporarily, and you can say to them, well, I was interested in this site prior to it being, bought after a certain date. So I'm not sure how it would work, but there are ways of communicating directly with the team, and then you can use that to try and see if maybe you could make the website, like say if someone bought twitch-gaming.com in the future, saying, well, okay, it's owned by someone else now, but what about the previous owner? Can we make it available for people in the past? But then there's terms and conditions they're enormous. That goes beyond what I'd, sitting there trying to go through it would take ages. But yeah, I understand. I think for me personally, I'd like to see the original version of the website stay on if possible. Yeah, definitely. So if I go back to 2016, like you were referencing there, the domain's gone. So, okay, I need to go back a bit further. This is what it looked like. I believe this is what it looked like back in 2012, 2011. So you can get to see what the site looked like, see what different events were happening at the time. It's quite cool being able to do that. But you'll notice that some of the images at the bottom are broken though. The Internet Archive isn't very good at crawling through a website that have active components. It will only crawl through and store static images, etc. But even those images, if they're using scripts, they won't be able to be accessed. So if I say wanted to go through September 2010, try and find the images, if they've not been crawled, they won't be able to find that. But they do offer the option for you to go back through the history, and if, say, in a particular separate crawling of the website, they were able to find the information, you could go through, find the previous URL, and even though it doesn't match that date, it will still say, well, from this date, XYZ, you were able to find the file. So this is Edinburgh, Edinburgh Linux Users Group. I go to a wee bit of history there. So I wonder what happened if I went to TechMeetUp. So we have back to 2008. This is what it looks like today, or at least as close as possible. You'll see, interestingly, in 2013, it looked very similar. If I go back to the first time in 2009, unfortunately, yeah, that wasn't intentional, but yeah, absolutely. And of course, they're saying that the first meeting and the second meeting was a very success, about 70 people. So hopefully it will go well in the future. So that's quite cool. Like, look back.
9.5 years later.
Yeah, we're using the Internet Archive to find the first entry of it. Unfortunately, as you can see, the archive can sometimes have difficulties crawling and getting the true accurate way of the way a website was designed to be formatted. So sometimes it's hit and miss. Most of the time it's okay, at least in my experience, but sometimes it won't. So this is what I was referring to, the terms and conditions that are massive. And then what's the copyright policy? So you can write to them. You can say, I'm the copyright holder of a particular material that's been held on another website. And if you can produce credentials to match that, then you can have that material removed. So, but they always try to be transparent about that, and the team will try and give information to match that. So the legacy of the Computer Chronicles. This is Stuart Shehraz today. As you'll see in your supplement, there's links to some talks there. Unfortunately, had we have printer issues, so one of the YouTube links got cut off. But you could just put the talk title into YouTube and it should come up okay. He's become very popular, and I know that Stuart Shehraz is in the middle of trying to produce a play to catalogue Gary Kildall's life that will be shown in the United States, and then he wants to make it available worldwide through DVD, etc. And he's also considering writing a book about the Computer Chronicles. The Internet Archive and the Wayback Machine, lasting legacy again, a tool can anyone that can use to go through the history. And who knows what the future holds. I think with the Internet Archive being there, I'm glad that there's at least some sort of history. We're moving at such a fast pace today. It's good that you can go back through and see where things were even 10, 15 years ago and how much has changed in that time. And that brings me to the end of the talk, and thank you for your time.
Any questions?
You were browsing in a private window. Is that because you don't trust the Wayback Machine?
Sorry, please say that again.
You were browsing in a private window.
Yeah, no, that was just to avoid any conflicts or anything. I wanted it to be a pure session, but then I had other stuff in my main browsing history that I didn't want to erase. So. Okay. Hi.
It may interest you to know there are other archiving sites available now that use a browser, and they render the website in question, and then they save an image of it. So you have a complete web page. So that's obviously the problem you were having. Obviously, it doesn't work for one in the past, but for the future, it's there.
Right. Do you know which ones exist? No.
I think it's called archive.is.
Okay.
Is one of them, but there's a few.
That's interesting. Okay. Hi.
Does archive.org honour the right to be forgotten as put out by the EU currently?
Yes. Yeah, it does. You can. Oh, I know what you mean. No, it does it in terms of like Google. Yeah, not that I'm aware of, no, because they're US based, but that personally I'm not aware of. No. Hi.
Just one based on that. I've actually had experiences before where I needed something removed from Wayback Machine, and they do honour it.
Oh, great. That's good to know. Okay. Because they've always been quite transparent, but it's good to have actual information.
Yeah, just need to verify that you are the owner of it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Alex?
Hi.
I was just going to mention, you said the archive was a video and a lot of your web content. I just wanted to mention that they've also archived a lot of classic games from the 1980s.
Yeah, that's true.
So like MS-DOS games, arcade games, Amiga games. That is a good way to waste the weekend.
Absolutely. No, it's amazing the breadth of it. There's something there for everyone. They have concert collections that go from rock music to classical music, you know, and as long as the original composer allows that to be made available, if they're still alive, then yeah, it's amazing what can be found. Okay.
Well, thank you very much. We're going to take a 5-minute break, and then we're going to have Gordon give the second talk. Where's Gordon? Oh, there he is.
That's great.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
If I could have your attention, please. If you could all have a seat, please. So, before we start a second talk, I'd like to take this time to say TechMeetUp is sponsored by Skyscanner, Cultivate and Informatics Ventures. Another thing I want to say is if you enjoy the talks tonight and you'd like to give a talk, a TechMeetUp, come and talk to me and we'll make it happen. And with that, we'll have Gordon talk about, what was it, data politics?
Cambridge Analytics and what's gone wrong with technology.
Yeah, go for it.
Sorry? Oh, okay. So, you know when you have a new television series, people give you a recap of last time. So actually I'm going to do 2 complete presentations today because I'm going to start by recapitulating the entire slide deck in my last presentation. And this picture is it. So last time I spoke at TechMeetUp, I said basically, if the Holy Father has a sticker over the camera of his iPad, that means privacy is going to be a big thing. And so I'm feeling slightly vindicated that what we're now seeing with Mark Zuckerberg trapped in the headlights is that privacy really is a big problem. So previously on TechMeetUp, as you saw, we can go all the way back to 2008 if you want. I've probably got that slide deck on here somewhere. Right, so what are we talking about tonight? We're talking about the big controversies of the day. What's happening with Brexit, with Trump, with Cambridge Analytics. The reason it says plus the S&P is because I originally did this for the S&P. I gave it an S&P branch last week. So although I'm in computing, I've been programming since the 1970s, I have another life in politics. So I worked in political magazines in London and Belfast. I was in Belfast during the war. That was in the 80s and the 90s. I was a candidate in 99, Scottish Labour Party. I was a candidate for the SNP in 2005 for Westminster. But what I've mostly done in the background is electoral computing. So I started doing that about 95. I worked as a key seats computing officer. I had a job. It was my voluntary work. I did key seats in the 97 election for Labour in Scotland. I reviewed the electoral systems of the SNP when I joined in 2002. I implemented the SNP systems in 2005 when I was a candidate. So I have a long background in the sort of things that Cambridge Analytics have or haven't done, right? And what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk you through quite a long history of where we are and what's actually happening and give you some sort of real sense of what this means because it's quite histrionic. So we're in a kind of a phase at the moment which is beginning to die down where I can't work the bipper. Hello? Right. Everyone's in a panic. Elections are over. It's all been run by a man, you know. It's all doomed. Cambridge Analytics are rigging everything. We're never going to have a free election again. That's slightly hysterical. Things are not quite that bad, right? Elections haven't stopped. There's no brain control. We're not in the grip of Goebbels. Things are not particularly good in politics at the moment, but the world hasn't ended. So I'm going to take you on a quick run through the history of electoral computing. Back to the beginning. Electoral computing starts with running elections on kit like this. This is a 5.5-inch floppy drive. This would be about mid-1980s BBC Micro. In those days, you could run a polling district on a computer, and you would need about 75 computers to run a constituency. So Edinburgh would be running about 350 computers running to run a constituency on election day only. That's more or less all you could do. And in fact, so in the elections in the 1980s, people ran so when I worked the 83 election and the 87 election, that was all run on paper. We had sheets and sheets of paper, we had carbon paper, and we did lists. So, but in the beginning, you start getting the very early days these simple computers, and they
What do you mean run an election? Like,
so I send out my canvassers, and they knock on your door, and they ask you, are you going to vote? You put that in a computer. It used to be you put that on paper. You had racks and racks and racks and racks of paper. And gradually these things get better and better and better and better and better. So by 1995, we're running a constituency on 3 computers, and that was mostly to scale the input. We could have run it on 1 computer, but I wanted to have 3 typists because all the typists had full-time jobs, right? So they only worked in the evening. So by the time we get to 2005, we put all of Scotland on a single computer. And now you can have the whole of the UK on a computer. So in the 1980s, you're talking about 75,000 computers to run the UK, of which there might have been 20 actually in operation. Whereas now, big data is a thing, right? And we see that as well when we actually look at all the things that people talk about Cambridge Analytics, big data and analytics. So when I first in 96 started looking at using commercial segmentation of the electors, so we segment by asking you how you voted, and that's the core data. Do you vote for us? Do you not vote for us? And we check, did you vote last time? That's the core segmentation data. But we started buying socioeconomic data. And when I talked to Acorn that we used at the bank, their sample rate was about 200 per constituency. And my sample rate in Govan was 16,000 for a constituency. So we talked to a third of the population, and they could say that people in G41 were richer than people in G40. And you're going, oh, really? I would never have guessed, right? And so you had this very, very crude notion of data. So we had big data, we had analytics, and for a very, very long time, we were way, way, way ahead of what the computing people were way ahead of what the public could stand, right? So because parties are run by volunteers, the lowest common denominator, we're now talking about using mobile phone stuff, but you need all your members to have a mobile phone before you can do that because they're normal people, right? So a lot of the times, and when you look at things, I did geo mapping, putting electoral things on data on maps in 1996. But to buy the maps for one constituency, 9 tiles at £100 each, that was £900. That was a one-user license, so I could use it on one computer. I had to buy a new computer because I need to buy new software to show the maps. So that was another £2,000. So I spent £4,500 to get a single mapping. So historically, we were way, way, way ahead. And people think, oh, politicians don't know anything about computers. It's slightly bollocks. We know quite a bit about it. So we have a long history of understanding how we use computers in elections. And the new stuff it does kind of fit into that. The other story in my tale comes from understanding how political parties are regulated. And this slide probably doesn't mean as much to you as it does to people in the SNP, but this is Billy Wolfe, who's running for the SNP in the constituency I stood in Linlithgow in the 60s. And you'll notice that you probably won't notice, but to anyone else, the size of the candidate's name is much, much larger. Wolfe, 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 Wolfe with SNP then. The reason was, until only comparatively recently did political parties exist in any legal sense in the UK. Prior to 1970, the party's name wasn't on the ballot paper. So the construction of the regulation of British elections is focused on how you manage an individual standing for Parliament. And it's very tightly regulated, and it's all focused about the candidate's name. And what happens in 1970, the parties, parties were totally bizarre. So in the 1920s, the Conservative Party has 2 major wings, but the Westminster parliamentary wing cut a deal with the tax office when I think Baldwin was the Prime Minister, what did that make it, late 20s? In which it was deemed to be the property of the leader of the Conservative Party as voted by the 1922 committee for tax purposes, if it was privately his money, but he didn't have to pay capital gains tax. And when the leader of the Conservative Party changed, it was as if the legal personality changed, so there was no death duties. Very totally weird. And that ran through until David Cameron, or John Major actually, I think, you started getting political parties became legal things in law. So historically, we had elections regulated around, not around parties at all. And what happens in the 1980s is Mrs. Thatcher comes along, and because the law refers to the candidate's name, the Tories then start doing advertising like this in newspapers, which doesn't mention a candidate's name. And the belief then is that this isn't covered by election law, and therefore election expenditure explodes in the 80s, absolutely explodes. And we then moved and this was like really, you can't advertise in newspapers, it'll be illegal.
Was this national advertising?
Yeah. Any advertising that doesn't mention a candidate's name was deemed to be not covered by election laws. And this runaway thing runs up till the very famous by-election in the 90s, the Wirral by-election, which is 96 before the 97 election. And I don't know if any of you saw Michael Crick's programme on Panorama about the Tories. They had the battle bus going round and all the election expense dodging, and was on last year. Well, basically, it's an almost shot-for-shot remake of the one he made in 96 about this Wirral by-election. So by-elections had very loose election spending, so the limit was £35,000 in those days, whereas a constituency based around the candidate's name was limited to about 7. So the spending limits on what a named candidate can spend are really low. They're still about 7 or 8 pence per elector. You basically get 3 envelopes, 3 printed sheets of paper if you deliver them by hand per elector. That's basically what you're allowed to spend an election. And the Tories had sort of bent the rules saying we don't mention a candidate's name. In this by-election, the Labour Party spent £750,000, the Tories spent £400,000. So you got in this circumstance in which the main parties at Westminster were saying, the other side's cheating, so we're going to cheat as well. And you have this sort of world of funding and regulation that goes on. And we now have registered political parties. We have 2 separate sets of regulations for election spending. We have the old-fashioned criminal one, which covers the named constituency, and we have the Electoral Commission, which manages the parties. One is criminal law, one is civil law. And the whole thing is designed to give the appearance of legality and regulation whilst allowing people to take the piss. So we're now in a world of like slightly hooky, dodgy money, and that kind of comes from this history of funding. The other thing that really shaped politics, which is coming to an end, was that historically the Americans had a world in which Americans could spend money on television advertising and Europeans couldn't. You can't do political advertising. There are some loopholes in that. You can make cinema adverts. And Nigel Smith, who ran the No to the Euro campaign, told me that, and we did that in the SNP in 2007. We ran some television adverts, but you can't do television advertising. When you compare British and American politics or European and American politics and take out television advertising budgets, actually they're about the same. So the up cost in America is the fact that they spend huge amounts on television advertising. So now what's interesting about that is that as we lose advertising from television and it switches to the internet advertising is not regulated. So the barrier between America and Europe has collapsed. You can now buy as much Facebook ads as you like, provided you go around the back of the electoral spending laws. And one of the other things that we've seen, and the New Labour brought this in, there was a big focus on copying American electoral techniques. People are really, really interested in copying American electoral techniques. And what a lot of people don't understand is how radically different American politics is. And I chose to represent this topic with this photograph of the post-war Californian governor race with Warren. Warren goes on to become a Supreme Court justice. And Warren clearly, as you can see here, is a Republican, right? He's a Republican. He's running with Dewey. Was Dewey the Republican? Dewey got humped by Truman, didn't he, in '48? So he's clearly a Republican. But when you look at his adverts here, on this one he's the victory governor, and this one he's the non-party governor. And the reason is Warren goes into the gubernatorial elections, and he goes for the primary election, which is like our selection battle, and he duly wins the Republican primary, so he's a Republican candidate. But he also stands in the Democrat primary, and he also wins that. So he's also the Democrat candidate, right? So the American party system has a system where if you wish to be a candidate in the US, the primary elections are organized by the state and not the party. The parties in the US are partly nationalized, and they're also subsidized. And it sounds bizarre that America would have nationalized political parties, but they do, right? And they were nationalized for very good reasons. They were nationalized because they used to have in the South what was called the white primary, where the white people would decide who the candidate would be, and then there'd be no black candidates. Or in Boston, they'd have the Irish primary, and the Irish would decide. And the idea was if the state ran it and not the party, it would be open to anyone. And then they applied the idea that you would have no election spending, and suddenly you have very weak parties. You have to be a millionaire to be a candidate. So whenever I'm in the States and conversation turns up, I always ask American people, so when I stood for Westminster, what did my primary election cost? How much did it cost me to be a candidate? And it cost me about $40, because the SNP sets the rules and says, you can't spend any money. Everyone gets an equal chance. You get one side of an A4, in those days, one side of an A4 distributed. If you violate that by spending your own money, we'll expel you from the party. Whereas, of course, in the States, to be anything, my mother's cousin's friends, their neighbor was a state senator in California, and his primary was $60,000, right? So, and so when you say, how does Trump, who traditionally was thought of as a Democrat, end up being in the Republican Party? Because he can walk in. David Duke, the Nazi, has tried to be a Democrat presidential candidate, a Republican presidential candidate. He nearly became a Republican senator. The leader of the Illinois Nazis is now the official Republican candidate in a thing in Chicago because nobody else went for it. the Green Party decided not to stand in one race because it was very tight, and so the Republican guy got his driver to go and say, I want to be the Green candidate. He got 2,000 votes. The guy wins by 100. So all American politics is totally crazy, and the model comes from structural party organisation. You have a very strong candidate, you get your group of bright young people around you, and you win elections, and you spend lots of money. And anyone who's looking at the centrist party stuff these days sees exactly what they're trying to do.
Does that mean that it's incredibly hard to form a new national political party in America? Like, the SNP was created, as far as I know, out of basically nothing. It was a new thing. Would that be very hard to do in America?
Well, the SNP was founded in 1938, so it took a while to get here. The problem isn't founding new parties. The problem is killing old ones in the States because they're on life support, because the state pays for them. And people here, Jim Murphy famously said, well, I'm going to make the Labour Party, we're going to have primaries for all our candidates to make it really popular. And the Labour Party typically spends about £1 million in an election in Scotland. When the Tories did an open primary with Sarah Wilson, it was £45,000 per constituency. So running primary elections for the Labour Party would have cost them £2 and a bit million, twice as much as they spend on elections. So effectively in the States, that's free because the taxpayer pays it. So you have this huge taxpayer subsidy because when you go to vote in the primary election, they close the school, they send civil servants there to take the vote, right? And they all have to be paid. Whereas if the party had to raise that, we'd all be bankrupt. So it's a huge subsidy on these parties. And
well, in the States, you have to register as being a Democrat.
With the state, you have to phone up.
And how does that then affect how you can still vote though? In the primary, how does that work?
In some states, you can only vote, you have to be registered as a supporter to vote in the primary.
Right.
In some states like New Hampshire, if you're registered Republican or registered independent, you can vote in the primary, but not if you're registered for another party. Right. In some states, you can vote in your opponent's primary if you want. 7 of them are membership-based and 44 are non. So in some places, you have to go and huckle in a room, and in some places, these are, what's interesting, a lot of these things are actually simply old-fashioned stuff, right? There is a tradition in this country going back to the 19th century of primary elections and open conventions. And again, when Jim Murphy was talking about this, I pointed this one out. The most famous recent open convention selection of a candidate, which was very important by-election, one of the most important by-elections of my life, was when the Fermanagh and South Tyrone MP died, and Bobby Sands, who at the time was 40 days into a hunger strike, was selected as the candidate, which he proceeded to win the by-election and then die a week later. And Northern Irish politics was fairly dramatically changed by that. So, this is quite old-fashioned, but it's just the problem with the American Constitution, you can't change it. That's why they behave. The American political system is actually totally shit. The Constitution doesn't give you a right to vote. It has 4 amendments that restrain the ability of the state not to let you vote. So they can't discriminate against votes on the basis of age, they can't discriminate on the basis of sex, race, or payment of tax. What they can do is discriminate on the basis of criminal record, and one of the reasons you see the prison to jail pipeline is to effectively take black people off the electoral register. If you arrest somebody for a driving offence, felony, you can then disbar them permanently. So in some states, 11-15% of the electorate don't have a vote. And as late as 1944, in the former Confederate states, only 7% of the population had a vote, the adult population, white and black. So very, very, very bizarre. And they don't have equal boundaries, so that the politicians can rewrite the electoral boundaries. So it's all very, very, very bizarre. So the consequence of this means that Karl Rove was George Bush's Texas hitman when I was doing data for the Labour Party. If you want to be a Republican candidate in Texas, Karl Rove had the canvass returns. He owned the results of knocking on doors, and he owned the donors list. So if you wanted to be a candidate and you want to say, well, we'll go and get the people who voted Republican last time, of course, sign the check here and here. I'd like to raise some money. We can go back to the donors, and I'm on 15%. And so you end up with what in the States is called the money primary. You can't be a candidate unless you can raise enough money to get access to purchase the supplies. Whereas in the UK, Karl Rove's equivalent are people who are party members, and the data is owned by the party. And the other thing that we have that makes this totally toxic is obsession with America. People are completely like, oh, the West Wing, we want to be like American politics. And it's mostly honking nonsense, to be honest, and very, very dangerous. And the consequence of these things ties together in a number of ways. People don't normalize statistics about politics. So Obama had this huge team of 300,000 people working on election day. This is an enormous army of fantastic people. If you then divide that by America's 60 times the size of us, if you normalize that, that's 5,000 people. The S&P has 130,000 members. The Radical Independence Convention, which was a left-wing group in the Indy Ref, got 5,000 people out canvassing on 3 or 4 occasions. And they, so this idea that the Americans have this, and people talk about the Americans' computer systems and they do all this stuff. Well, they spend all this money because it's shit. They've only got one election at a time. The system, so they only hold the presidential stuff. They don't hold the senators and the state senators and stuff. Whereas in the UK, the party will have, the SNP has, if your door was knocked on more or less any time since probably even as early as 86 or 87, that contact will be in the system because every time, because we have proper parties. Whereas in the States, the data you have depends on who you can purchase it from last time and how much money you've raised. So a lot of this stuff about American computer systems, aren't they amazing? And they spend all this money and they hire all these great people. They're just making work, right? They're just generating huge amounts of work. And the other side of it also works. So when you look at, in 2006, the SNP put up a new online system which raised £10,000 online in a week. And when you normalise that, that's $900,000 normalised dollars in a week. And to try and understand what the world was like in 2006, no Facebook, no Twitter, no YouTube. So in 2005, when I wanted to go and when we wanted to do video of people, I think I brought one. We actually went and made little films and delivered them by hand because you couldn't deliver them anyway, right? And I thought, as we're doing the Wayback Machine, I thought I would get the Wayback Machine out and show you what electoral computing looked like in 1996. Where are you? There's not very much of it left, I'm afraid, but handwritten HTML. I did find the videos, but they're all encoded in a Microsoft format that doesn't replay. Literally, you can see the logos all disappeared. We were still talking about wars in the Middle East those days. Remember that? So things were pretty primitive. So you need to be quite. Whoops. You need to think about this all the time, and we see this again. There's a big thing about how the Tory party spent more on Facebook than the SNP did last week. And you're going, yeah, okay, but you need to multiply our number by 8. And then it turns out we spent more than the Tories did because their electorate is 8 times as big, right? And we're the biggest, richest party in the UK by normalised numbers, so of course we spent more money than them. So a lot of the discussion about American systems is basically hype. And the consequence of this is that people who are most obsessed with Labour Party in particular, the Tories to a certain degree. And what's damaging about this is we've gradually seen a separation between the party of government and the party of election. So in the SNP and in the old days in the Labour Party, when Tony Blair was in charge or when Mrs Thatcher was in charge, the team that ran the election and the team that formed the government were the same people. And as you bring in the American model, you start bringing in Linton Crosby's or Cambridge Analytics, you start bringing people in merely to win the election. And they're not intrinsically concerned with the government that comes afterwards. And so you get this disconnect between what is necessary to win and what do I do after I've won. And we see that with Brexit, where they're getting these people and they say, oh, well, tell everyone you're going to get lots of money back for the NHS, that's popular. They do that and say, okay, well, we're not going to get any money back for the NHS. Or just tell them that Northern Ireland won't be a problem. They're going, well, Northern Ireland is going to be a problem. So once you start getting that separation between the two, that has consequences, and that's an important thread in what's going on. But what happened to the Labour Party then is once they started disconnecting, you start getting gibberish like this, right? So everyone who was in the meeting to do this had done a PPE at Oxford, and none of them had fought a council election. And they produced stuff like that, and you're going, get you, come on. Astonishing drivel. And Miliband goes to the States, makes a huge effort to be photographed in the White House talking to Obama across the table because he wants to be seen as this and, you know, anyway. And you also get the other circumstance. Douglas Alexander leads Labour's effort in computing. He goes to America for every election. He understands all the buzzwords. He's their campaigning maestro. And yet we know from when he lost to Mary Black, I mean, if the camera wasn't on, I'd tell you, but I kind of, there are certain elements of election tradecraft that we know, and that we know that his constituency can't do them. His constituency party of Labour's head of campaigning couldn't do the political equivalent of putting your underpants on right side forward, right? Really, really basic stuff. And the reason is because they're all upset because what would somebody in Paisley know about elections? It's the Americans, and it's just... so when you put this combination together, you start getting, on top of these three trends, so the trends we've got are increasing use of computers, increasing copying of American systems, increasing dodginess around election funding, a separation of the campaigning team from the governing team, and on top of that you add technology. And this is the combination of these factors that's causing this problem. And people talk about the politics of Silicon Valley, and they have all these theories, and Twitter has a political theory on free speech called radical free speech, which said that, you know, free speech must be out, and it's all in the name of freedom, and people will do stuff. Conveniently enough, radical free speech as a philosophy of technology also means you don't have to pay people to moderate content on your site. So it has this miraculous property of juicing your returns, which is not connected in any way. This is a genuinely thought out, genuinely thought through the philosophy, you know, Spinoza, we've all read Locke, you know what I mean? I have discussed David Hume with this, let's not hire people. No. And so what you get is, you know, we all know that Twitter's you know, waves of trolling, waves of stuff, and the same thing we're now seeing with Facebook. So Facebook, as Alex was saying at the back, we've known this for years. We've got the point where the Pope knows it, and then suddenly we've tipped over. So a lot of this crisis actually comes from the combination of things. And on top of these structural factors, the last factor is a critical political factor. Now, do people know These Islands? It's a British nationalist think tank that's going. So there are a couple of arguments with These Islands. And These Islands is a phrase that John Hume, who Nobel Peace Prize winner, MP, founder of the Social Democrat and Labour Party, used to use the phrase "these islands," and it's a really, really, really powerful phrase. It picks up on a poem by Seamus Heaney from the Troubles in Northern Ireland called "Whatever You Say." Well, one of the lines is "Whatever you say nothing." And so John Hume, an Irishman living in an Irish city, elected to Parliament, an Irish politician. Here he's been searched by soldiers. This photograph's probably 72, 73. I think he's already elected to Parliament by this stage. What's interesting about, when we look at technology and algorithms and A/B testing and doing stuff, and we see what the Brexit team did, the focus was on using technology to test messages and find the ones that garner the strongest reactions, and then double down on them, double down on them, double down on them. And you get this politics of hot buttons where you say, right, let's find what gets the electorate rolling. And what's fascinating about These Islands and the phrase "these islands" and John Hume is that phrase not only does it have any hot buttons, it doesn't have any buttons at all. In a world in which people are literally, I mean, I worked in politics in Belfast after the war. I mean, people were literally being blown up, right? One of my friends was in his party and got his house pipe bombed. John Hume managed to create a language that doesn't even contain the words Ireland and Britain, right? And what we actually have with Donald Trump and with Brexit to a degree, and what we've seen in Hungary with Orban, is this disinhibiting of political messages. Trump is happy to stand up and say Mexicans are rapists. Orban is happy to stand up and say in scarcely coded words, there's a Jewish conspiracy against Hungary. Nigel Farage will stand up with a picture of refugees, basically saying brown people are coming to steal your possessions. And we've seen them. And when you combine these things with the precursors, you start getting this poisonous thing. So Cambridge Analytica and these companies and the Brexit people will say, let's go and find the most resonant message and press that just merely to get votes. And when you look at the amount of messages that Cambridge Analytica put out in the States, they tested 6.5 million different messages, right? And these, whatever gets a reaction, and we saw that on the other side, the non-political side. I don't know if people followed the story of the Montenegrin kids. So Facebook steals so much money from publishers that you can't, if you have a newspaper and rely on Facebook to distribute your news, you don't get enough revenue to pay your journalists. Your business model is broken. So these Montenegrin kids discovered that you could run effectively news organizations that were profitable, provided you just made up stuff, right? Your journalistic costs are low. You've got a testing mechanism funding one that gets results. So these kids would say, you know what, if you say Hillary's a lesbian child killer, you get 1 million shares on Facebook. And that turns into $24,000 in a month. And there's a couple of villages where the kids discovered this, and they've all got motorbikes and cars, and they don't give a monkeys. They just throw in stuff in, right? Facebook doesn't care, and so Zuckerberg does one of his big apologies about fake news. He made a big statement about fake news. We're going to tackle fake news on Facebook. He published it on Facebook, and it was a big thing here. And then there was a series coming down this side was a series of sponsored posts, and coming down that side was a sponsored post. Fake. All the top posts around his fake news announcement were completely fake. So it's this combination of things that we're getting.
Do you think the things you were just talking about, like the testing messages and stuff, happens on either side in the independence referendum?
Messages are tested, A/B testing happens, but what previously has happened is that it's the separation of the campaigning side from the governing side that matters, because if you're only interested in winning, then you'll follow that message to wherever gets the response, right? Whereas, there's probably quite a good, there probably might be a sub-market that would say, let's burn the English out, right? You could chase that down to probably 200,000 or 300,000 people in Scotland would cheerfully take a message of slaughter the English pigs in their beds, right? But funnily enough, parties don't do that, right? On either side. It's the disinhibition that's the problem.
But just like, I'm wondering if there's parallels to the Brexit, because they were both referendums and stuff. It wasn't purely party political. Like, obviously, for example, the SNP were like probably 99% pro-independence or whatever, but it wasn't just the SNP. Presumably the Greens or whatever.
Yeah. The thing I will say to people is that you need to separate out techniques from politics. And so Nicola has a helicopter, right? And Alec had a helicopter. And we copied Jim Wallace of the Liberal Democrats because that was a cheap way because he showed in 2003 that a small party could have, the purpose of a helicopter is to get you in the local papers in 6th place on the same day. That's what it's put there for, right? And you say, well, that's great. But if you trace back the helicopter, you end up in 1932 with a campaign called Hitler Over Germany, invented by Paul Joseph Goebbels, right? So techniques don't have any intrinsic meaning, right? It's the use to put them. So A/B testing, is this message a good message? Isn't the problem. It's choosing any message that gets a reaction and pushing on that is the problem. It's the disinhibition.
But if you're going to, your political opponents are using these dubious methods, and is it better that you sort of match them in the dubious methods in order that you are then elected and doing the right thing, rather than,
But the problem is you can't. If you win by a dodgy election, you can't then. There's no walking away. The thing is, there are techniques, because these aren't new problems, right? Dodgy election promises aren't new problems. It's interesting, if you read election material, so one of the things I keep saying to people is, there's quite a good book about running and winning an election written by Cicero's brother in 80 BC, right? How to win an election, right? So these things have happened, and you read the elections like the Marius versus thingy, the Gracchi, and what was Marius's opponent in Rome? Julius Caesar was a Marian. Who was the other guy? Killed him. I never can't remember. But the Roman Republic. These things have all happened. But what we need to do is understand. We need to look at regulation. We need to find a regulatory solution to these problems, right? So some of them are properly regulate election spending, so they're not unregulated. Bring in regulation on how much you can spend on internet, that kind of thing. And we have a technique that we use to manage messages called P&P. The American equivalent of this is what you see on adverts. My name is Gordon Guthrie and I approve this message. P&P means printed and published by. So if you see somebody handing out political stuff on the street, pens, wonks, balloons, go and pick one up and you'll find in tiny letters a P&P with a name and an address. So all political messages emitted in the UK have to contain a thing that allows you to challenge them. And the presumption of this legislation was that the cost of producing things was high. So I'd print 1,000 leaflets and the distribution was open, and therefore magically my opponents would find out the material I was putting out because it was freely circulating. One of the problems with the internet thing is if I produce 6.5 million messages and I narrowcast them on Facebook to you, and you, I can tell you things, and there's no mechanism for my political opponents to then challenge me about, because you've seen it on your machine, it's ephemeral, and you never know that I said, they're coming to rob you, those thieving bastards, overbuying, and I've told you, So what we need to do is go back to first principles and look at the digital world and say, how do we, and the purpose of that is once you get this, then you can start challenging people on the messages they're putting out. You can start making them, you can't regulate and say this is correct and this is wrong, but you can make it back to a battle, a discussion and a real political thing. So, and I've talked to some friends in the trade who do psycho-personographics and stuff with Cambridge Analytica, and they're not that enormously impressed. I mean, people say Obama did this kind of thing. Obama's model and the SNP's model was very much about using social media tools to get me to share a piece of material that Facebook would then push into your timeline or your Twitter. And that has very, very high impact. The Cambridge Analytics model was to use data scraping to get information about you, and then use that to push messages directly to you, so advertise to you and do pro-segmentation. So they're not strictly comparable, but I don't think Cambridge Analytics are the evil they're not evil geniuses, that they're made out to be. I don't think their techniques are necessarily that good. It really is the combination of all these things, and they're funded by very right-wing American billionaires. They really don't care about the message they're putting out. Some of the stuff they've done in the Nigerian elections and the Kenya elections, where they're finding hot buttons. Oh, what did I just do? I always say to people, if you want to know what hot button elections can look like, imagine if you ran hot button in Northern Ireland, right? So, what are the hot buttons? Arlene Foster, the First Minister, the DUP First Minister, people say, oh, she's really hard on those Catholics, isn't she? Her father was a machine gun in her kitchen and survived. Her school bus was bombed, right, to try and kill the bus driver. She had to pull this is a primary school bus. She had to pull her friend out with her hair on fire, right? So you want to find some hot buttons, right? You want to find hot buttons, we got hot buttons, right? And you apply that kind of shit to this country, okay, parts of this country, things go very, very badly, very, very badly wrong. So it's this, the problem with these things is actually this combination of things. And we need substantially a political problem in the US with Trump, and the decay of the Republican Party has been decaying gradually for 20 years. It's almost impossible to stop that happening without changing the electoral law in the States, and you can't change the electoral law because the Constitution can't be changed because it's an 18th century Constitution and it's designed for 13 states, not 52. So, so bad things are happening in the world of electoral computing, but they're not all bad, and there are some very clear and straightforward solutions to some of the problems. And that's me.
Right. Any questions?
I've always been quite interested in that sort of technological utopianism where it's used around sort of politics and computer networks. On one of these documentaries, it mentioned the 1979 Tory party defeat, or whatever you call it, win, was largely done through market research on a very new computer system. Is there any truth to this?
It would have been analysing the results of market research on a computer, so simply crunching statistical numbers. It was part of it, but the roots of that victory go back to the Labour Party was falling to pieces. The Tories had started an ideological process of thinking up a new platform, going back to the late 60s. I mean, there was a whole range of things. It wasn't the Labour Party always used to pretend that evil capitalists were brainwashing. I mean, we've been they brainwashing us has been a trope of British politics for 30 years, and it just changes how the brainwash. So part of Cambridge Analytics is just the same cold cow hair top. I mean, all political parties use sophisticated techniques, but they're not intrinsically evil or bad. Or
there's no real difference to what, like, say, Mori do for political parties. It's just like market research or whatever.
yeah, I mean, I did it for the campaign for the Scottish Parliament referendum. I did message development for Partnership into Power in '97 and stuff. I mean, you run some opinion polls.
Radical in a sort of data sciencey sort of way of the information they used to come up with. And it was almost like it was described as they were coming up with policies through a sort of AI sort of thing.
No, it wouldn't have been AI. I mean, you can. One of the problems that the centrists are discovering now, trying to invent a new party, is that if you follow the opinion polls, you end up. Opinion polls are useful, tell you where you are, but they don't lead you anywhere. They lead you into sort of soft mush. They tell you so. If the SNP had followed opinion polls, we wouldn't have had an independence referendum because we were 70-30 down. I mean, if you follow the opinion polls, you give up, right? The Greens, you're on 5%. Piss off. You know what I mean, where are you going? Well, they say, well, actually, I want to be on 8%. So the point of opinion polls is to tell you what you have to change within the electorate, right? It's a guidebook. And if you just follow, we're going to... But one of the things about this split messaging is that you can try and do that. You can try, and everyone targets different messages to different people. And you can try and tell people, but the story doesn't hang together, and you can't make it. It's retail politics. It's difficult to build a movement on retail politics where I give you £5 off parking, and I give him. There are big building blocks that work around employment and pension, but they're sort of super micro. I'm going to add people who collect China dolls to people who like Vespers, and I'm going to put. That's what multiple layering is like. It's a bit. I've never seen it work. Whatever.
So the Open Rights Group have been lobbying recently more about electronic voting and their opinions on that. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, I wrote something for the Times about that. I did a talk to the Open Rights Group about it. I'm 100% against electronic voting. It totally prevents... The problem with electronic voting is that the count... we currently now have a very sophisticated counting mechanism that you can completely verify the count is legal. The candidate can appoint polling people who can go to the polling station. You can check the box is empty. You see when it's sealed. You can get updates on the turnout throughout the day. The box is brought into the campaign centre. It first has a count on that to verify that the number of papers in the box match the turnout that's been reported, so no one's tamped it on the way. You can sample the box on the first count, and then you have people on the full count, and it's almost impossible to break that count. Any moving to digital voting, all of that goes away. And the real problem isn't fixing the vote. The problem is what happens when you have a candidate who's not in good faith. So we had Nazi candidates in West Lothian who got 34 votes, 72 votes. With electronic voting, the Nazi can say, I got 3,500 votes. And what do I say? I say, no. You need to understand, we've got these large prime numbers that we're going to factorize with elliptical curves, and the proof of that, and then you see Alice talks to Bob, and Bob talks to Charlie, and you're even. You can't win it, right? And Trump is doing this. Trump is saying, I won the vote. No, he lost the vote. So if you have an actor who's willing to totally lie, whereas actually when you have the current system, the papers are laid out, and the Nazis' papers don't even fit in a pizza box, right? You only got that much. You don't say I got 3,000 votes. You're going, fuck off, yeah, Tim Hitler. Sorry, come on, I'm saying that on screen, but anyway.
Is that system for the paper votes that you just described the same across the UK, or is it Scotland specific?
No, it's the same across the UK. The counting system is uniform. Unlike the US, which is on a per county base, US elections, the OECD does not send election monitors to the United States because they know they won't be able to certify the result, and they have not sent one since the 60s. So the US elections are known to have been completely bent since the year dot.
Right, final question.
So I think what you suggested about PNP for internet communications and also for let's stick with PNP. I've forgotten what the other one was. But I think it's a very interesting idea. But is there anything in place at the moment? Oh yeah, the other one was about funding for communications over the internet during an election. Is there anything in place at the moment moving towards regulation of these things?
There isn't at the moment, but I'm certainly talking to people that for a long period it's been like, oh, here comes the nutter talking about his stuff, but things have slightly changed now. So I think we're going to try and put some all party stuff together over the summer to try and do this and get away, just because there are quite simple things that can do it. There's nothing new under the sun. People have been cheating at elections for a very long time, you know, and it's all good fun.
Okay. Well, thanks, Gordon.
See you in 8.5 years.
Right. I think that was it for our TechMeetUp tonight. Thanks everyone for coming. What we're going to do is go to doctors. I would appreciate if you could help a little bit, kind of